Okay, hi everyone. Hello. We're going to begin. I just want to welcome you all here on behalf of the Critical Humanities for the Liberal Arts program. This is we're very pleased to welcome our speaker, Dr. Thomas Moynihan, whom Professor Ray Gracier will introduce in a moment from the philosophy department. I'm very pleased that this is our last talk in a series of events and talks that we had this year around the topic of extinction, which was also coincidental with a new course that we're teaching in our program. And I'm happy to see some of the students here who have had a chance to also engage with and read Thomas's work. So this is a very nice opportunity to have him here with us. Without further ado, I will just let Ray introduce Thomas, and then we can jump into the talk. All right, welcome again, and thank you for coming.
Okay, thanks Nadia. We're very pleased to welcome today Thomas Moynihan. Thomas is a UK-based writer and author. He's published 2 books. The first was entitled Spinal Catastrophism, A Secret History, published by MIT Press in 2019, and his second and most recent book is entitled X-Risk, How Humanity Discovered Its Own Extinction, which was published by MIT in 2020. Thomas holds a DPhil from Oriel College, Oxford, and he is currently a research affiliate at Cambridge University's Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, as well as a program director at the New Centre for Research and Practice and a research affiliate at the Berggren Institute Antikythera think tank. Through his writing, Thomas aims to tell compelling stories about how changing ideas about the ways and workings of the wider universe have, throughout the past, time and again transformed our deepest sense of our potentials and priorities as beings who think, act, and often make mistakes. Aside from publishing numerously with academic presses ranging from Oxford University Press to Palgrave, Thomas's writing on everything from the climate crisis and dinosaurs to dolphin intelligence has been featured in places like BBC Future, The Guardian, The New Scientist, Aeon, Noema magazine, The Independent, and Vice. He's been a keynote at institutions ranging from Stanford University to Hong Kong's Tycoon Contemporary, and he's been interviewed about his work by BBC Radio 4, CBC Radio, and The Atlantic magazine's Rethink podcast. So finally, without further ado, Thomas's talk this evening is entitled Orienting Ourselves in the Broadest Possible Sense on Pragmatism and Cosmic History. And this talk will feature is the part of a forthcoming book project. So it's work in progress, which is continuing but also kind of revising some of the theses advanced in his previous work, X-Risk.
Thank you, Ray.
Go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Also, thank you, Nadia and Ray, for hosting and inviting me. It's a real honor to be here. So without further ado, as Ray said, the title is Orienting Ourselves in the Broadest Possible Sense on Pragmatism and Cosmic History. So I want to begin with a quote from Wilfrid Sellars, the American philosopher. I know Ray is very familiar with this. So in 1962, Sellars offered the following definition of philosophy. He said, "The aim of philosophy, abstractly formulated, is to understand how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. It's about orientation, in other words." In Sellars' view, no holds can be barred when it comes to properly orienting ourselves in the world. As I want to explore in this talk, this means that any pragmatism worthy of the name inherently becomes cosmic in its stance and scope. That is, it melds our sense of what agents like us must ultimately do with our models of the unfolding universe at large. Pragmatism, after all, consists in thinking about thinking not as a mirror for detachedly reflecting existence, but as a tool for thinking, living, and adapting within it. Yet, most of existence is not to be found on or around Earth's surface. Of course, the words cosmic and pragmatism might seem unusual bedfellows. Pragmatism, after all, is known for being down to earth, yet the apparent conflict, as I hope to show or argue, is largely illusory. For rationality is the rejection of the self-centered in search of what's unanchored from blinkered horizons. The only authority that reason respects consists in justifications and warrants stripped of all such residue, or those that at least aim to apply equally to anyone, anywhere, anywhen. Accordingly, rationality cannot accept any merely arbitrary bound or terminus on its search, whether this rests in the inherited limitations of our sensory organs, our transient lifespans, the quirk of where we find ourselves within the galactic filaments, or indeed mere incuriosity. Indeed, imagine an alternate history wherein everyone assumes strawberries are poisonous for whatever reason, and the human species ages and goes extinct without anyone ever having eaten a strawberry because nobody ever tested this erroneous belief. The fact this scenario strikes us as perverse testifies to the fact that pragmatic inquiry can leave absolutely no stone unturned, and that experiment must indefinitely go on, regardless of distance of object or difficulty of goal. Because we cannot know the practical upshots in advance of putting questions to nature, inquiry must be pursued wherever it leads, even to the outermost edges of space and time. Reasoning, therefore, is the tendency to float from somewhere and somewhen to a perspective progressively unmoored from all such embedding, all whilst never losing sight of the fact that every dilation of perspective ultimately still serves to orient the reasoner within their world. But what does this orientation involve? Crucially, it is necessary to orient ourselves in time as much as it is to orient ourselves in space. Indeed, one paramount way in which things hang together, in Sellers's phrase, is the ways in which what comes after is shaped by what came before. Under another guise, we call this history. History describes the ways in which the past exerts influence over the future. It is the arena of the contingent and the indelible, where events can unfold in multiple ways, but the fact of events having gone one way rather than any other feasible route permanently filters everything that can pan out thereafter. History is thus a concept of paramount practical import, for it is the sole medium within which actions of whatsoever sort come to matter. This again is because it is the arena of the contingent and the indelible. After all, actions matter only if the consequences they unleash would not otherwise have happened or are contingent. Their influence rests in the recognition that had they not taken place, then everything afterward would have unfolded differently also. And moreover, they matter more in proportion to how lasting these impacts are, and especially so if they cannot be reversed or are indelible. Hence why gaining a sense of orientation within history, within wider spaces of time, or asking and answering the question, where is now, is so immensely important. This doesn't just involve gauging how much time is behind versus how much more could be ahead. It also involves uncovering how divergently everything about the present would be if events in the past, which didn't need to have happened, had played out differently. Because only by coming to terms with this do we grapple with just how open and contingent what's ahead might also be. Only this way can we begin to become truly accountable for ourselves and our actions as individuals, societies, and perhaps as a human whole. But, as we'll see, to fully answer the riddle of where we find ourselves in time, we cannot only seek our place within our own biographies or those of our societies, we must also seek the position of now relative to the evolution of all life, the unfolding chronicle of our planet, and even the aging of the universe as a whole. Indeed, today, our societies struggle with the fact that the acknowledged horizon of historic influence has become truly expansive, in forms of nuclear waste, climate disruption, and mass extinction, we now recognize this arena has expanded far beyond the traditional remit of human affairs, having spilt into the deeper past and further future of Earth's unfolding biosphere. Therefore, the concepts of contingent and consequence have, by necessity, been stretched to the scale of the globe and the gigaannum. These are the stakes, providing the backdrop against which all our private aspirations and anxieties must unfold. Putting such stakes into further relief, science now has a relatively firm sense of how much past is behind and how much future could be left ahead for life on Earth. Here are the figures as contemporary science holds them. The universe is roughly 14 billion years old, 4 billion, skipping forwards. We've only been around for 300,000 years, roughly. Civilization, defined as large-scale cooperation of human groups, has been around for 7,000, maybe 8,000, maybe more, but it's not going to be revised upwards that much. And the radiometric dating, the technique of arriving at these figures, has only existed for 100 years. Compared to that, Earth's habitable future, based on the best geoscience and climate science that we currently understand, is something on the order of 1.5 billion further years. So humans have been around for a tiny amount of that time. On this view, compared to the past required to produce us, our species has only just appeared, but already the deleterious effects of our activities are being projected over a similarly protracted future. That's roughly 1.5 billion years of further habitability on Earth. Moreover, the means now exist or are on the horizon to permanently damage life on Earth. Entering the third millennium, it's not just the facts about human existence or the wider biosphere that are acknowledged to be contingent. The fact of human existence and a thriving biosphere has also become contingent. So, there could be a lengthy, vibrant future for life, or no future at all. We now acknowledge that events in the present, going one way rather than any other, may alter the planet's entire future, permanently filtering all that comes afterward in irreversible, yet potentially entirely contingent ways. So, how did we get to this point? So, I want to flesh out a bit more this idea of how I'm defining history. There are two types of systems in this universe, historical ones and ahistorical ones. Historical systems are those wherein the course of past events continues to constrain all that can possibly come next. Such systems exhibit what scientists call memory. Ahistorical systems, on the other hand, are those wherein any such influence of past events upon the future eventually washes away or is forgotten. Such systems are, in technical terms, memoryless. An example of an ahistorical system is one which reliably visits and revisits all its possible states with a null likelihood of never returning to any one of them. Given enough time, its past and its future will eventually look exactly the same. An example of a historical system, in contrast, is one which cannot pass through all its possible states, because the manifestation of certain possibilities in the past to the exclusion of others irreversibly constrains everything that can possibly happen thereafter. Its future will end up looking very different from its past. One great example of such a system is the evolution of life on Earth. The species that currently exist are a tiny, tiny majority of all that possibly could have existed, and they only exist because their ancestors propagated to the exclusion of all those other possibilities. And so, yes, to use some technical jargon, ahistorical systems are ergodic, whereas historical ones are non-ergodic. So, what's at stake in all of the following is the question of whether nature, beyond familiar and tangible scales, exhibits history in this technical, specific sense. Answers to this question, as we shall see, have drastically changed over the centuries as knowledge has accumulated about the wider universe. This is of practical importance because only in historical systems do actions truly come to matter, as I mentioned before, in the sense of permanently altering the future. Let's call this the horizon of historic consequence. I'm going to define this as that arena of space and time wherein people acknowledge history matters, because what can happen in the future is not independent of what's happened in the past. That is, that arena where what comes after is recognized as contingent upon what came before, in the sense that had previous events gone otherwise, everything thereafter would have played out differently also. This region extends from the present moment outwards into both the past and the future, making up the tapestry of influences without which the present wouldn't be what it is, alongside the cascade of downstream impacts dictating the direction in which all future moments flow. So, that's the horizon. What's beyond it? What lies beyond the acknowledged horizon of historic consequence, at least in the estimation of those doing the acknowledging? This will soon become clear, I hope, with examples, but beyond what is believed to be history's horizons, things aren't necessarily assumed timeless or static. Things here are presumed to change, to grow and decay, just not in a way that is thought to have persisting direction or permanence over time. Why? Because beyond the horizon, it is assumed no possibilities or opportunities can be permanently lost or become impossible to return to. All possibilities are reliably run through and eventually returned to, regardless of what's happened in the extended past. This is largely because beyond the horizon of the tangible and recorded and familiar and empirical, the scales of available time and space are, ahead of evidence to the contrary, assumed to be vast enough to exhaustively actualize the entire space of possibility, recurrently and or concurrently. After all, imagine a dice with n sides. Pick an arbitrary large number. If you imagine this dice being rolled, either sequentially or simultaneously, all n of its possibilities will be made manifest and reliably repeat. So again, what's beyond this horizon? Because of all this, beyond this horizon, all influence of the past on the present eventually washes away. The legacy of things going one track rather than any other will eventually become irrelevant because the alternate paths and possibilities remain accessible and will, given enough time, inevitably be passed through without limit. Over the longer run, there is thus no direction, no persistence, no memory. All impacts eventually are reversed, washing out into their opposites. All losses are eventually recouped or compensated as what is lost is returned. Beyond history's horizon, processes are presumed to be memoryless and meandering, thus neutering any acknowledged impact of what happens here and now at this larger global scale. So, why does any of this matter? Within the horizon, the course of past events matters practically. Beyond it, the course of past events is absolved of mattering, at least permanently or persistently. So, whilst you feel avoidable losses or local damages keenly within what you acknowledge as this horizon, you can always point beyond it to that scale or interval wherein you assume what's lost must be inevitably returned in order to remedy or diminish the sense of immediate damage. For the longest time, in my eyes, this is what most people have done when it comes to scales of space and time beyond the observable, in order to assuage themselves of fear that accidents and losses really matter in this wider cosmic sense. Indeed, the horizon of history is the arena within which concepts like loss, extinction, or squandered opportunity gain their full bite, because beyond it, they are defanged by cycling returns wherein everything lost is later regained. So, we are very fluent with these concepts of contingency and indelibility when it comes to our own biographies. For example, if I severely break my legs, I know I may never walk again. Because I recognize such misfortune isn't inevitable, I endeavor to avoid it. However, extending such concepts beyond our biographies, at least historically speaking, doesn't seem to come so intuitively. Prior to centuries of investigation, deciding whether the universe itself exhibits historicity remained underdetermined. In advance of accumulation of evidence to the contrary, it simply wasn't possible to satisfactorily falsify the alternate hypothesis that nature beyond our tangible scales simply unceasingly cycles, always eventually forgets, or never gains or loses its potentials. Tangible evidence of genuine history was required to refute this lingering intuition at increasingly encompassing scales. So, I know that's all been rather conceptual, but now I'm going to do some historical examples and hopefully flesh this skeleton out. So for the remainder, I will rehearse the history of how this evidence was accumulated and how, over the centuries, scientific inquiry has expanded this horizon to cover increasingly expansive scales of space and time, and in the process has thus progressively banished any comforting notion of eternity or cyclicity outward to the very edges of creation. So to rewind back to ancient times. So again, prior to the compiling of a unified anthropological record spanning continents, rather than being limited to just one, the question of whether the history of humankind exhibits any overall direction or simply cycles unceasingly was again underdetermined. Note that direction here implies nothing normative or evaluative. It simply refers to the possibility of epochal transitions and genuine novelties. The suggestion, for example, that agriculture was first invented at one specific place and time before spreading, as opposed to the assumption that there may have never been a time when someone, somewhere, wasn't practicing agriculture. Again, ahead of sizable evidence to the contrary, it is hard to falsify conjectures of cyclicity. Accordingly, by and large, pre-modern cultures seem to have held steady-state notions of global time. This was particularly true in Europe, where outlooks were notably cyclical. The ancient Greeks and Romans held that the past is so big, infinitely big, such that everything humanly possible has already been experienced innumerably many times. Identically, the future is so big, immeasurably so, such that everything now lost or squandered will later be inevitably regained or returned. Disasters can punctuate this and cause local ruin, but globally, this process goes on unceasingly. The Greeks and Romans, again, invariably assumed that time was therefore directionless. Any seemingly directional process, it was believed, would be counteracted by its opposite somewhere else in either time or space, such that, globally speaking, time lacks direction. For Plato, the past is, quote, of a long or infinite period of time, such that during that time, thousands upon thousands of peoples have existed, and by the same reckoning, as many have been destroyed. He believed that their social and political arrangements have been of every possible kind. Every possible permutation of moral and material betterment or decay, he believed, had been passed through innumerably many times. By the same token, they will be passed through again in the measureless future, regardless of what happens now. So again, in other words, you cannot irreversibly lose human possibilities, nor the possibility of human history as such. Indeed, Plato and many other later pagan philosophers believed catastrophes regularly destroy civilization, potentially at a global scale, erasing all accumulated human learning, thus putting an upward ceiling on cumulative knowledge. But they all believed that such calamity leaves no permanent legacy because, afterwards, civilization re-emerges, humanity reappears, everything is played out again in the same way. The arena of historical possibility was considered small enough that it would regularly exhaust itself and start again, without limit, cessation, or variation. In Aristotle's words, quote, probably each art and science has often been developed as far as possible and has again perished, not once, nor twice, nor occasionally, but infinitely often. By the same token, the same was assumed to hold for the unbounded future, no matter what. So, loss and destruction could only ever apply locally and transiently, never irreversibly or globally. So, for the ancient world, this horizon of history, of cumulative, persistent, directional process, didn't yet extend far beyond one's own polis. So, this is my attempt to diagram that. So, within this is the horizon where you get these regional processes, these directional processes, and beyond that you have meandering, cycling, non-directional processes. So, to move forwards in time towards the early modern period and the Renaissance. But before that, We're going to skip over a couple of millennia as well. So, with the rise and spread of Abrahamic religions, belief arose in a universal direction in time, arcing from Genesis to Judgment, applying equally everywhere throughout creation. Nonetheless, Abrahamic cosmologies do not accommodate historical contingency, particularly when it comes to wider nature in its independence of divine administration. For, in the last instance, everything is governed by divinity's judgment. By the late Middle Ages, however, there was an increasing sense of the autonomy of secular history from divine orchestration, partially due to the continual frustration of prophecies of imminent apocalypse shared across Abrahamic faiths. And during the Renaissance, this fed into and was fed by conviction that genuinely unprecedented things were being wrought and invented by human agency. Therefore, human ingenuity, rather than divine diktat, increasingly appeared to be steering history's rudder. But by the time of the Renaissance, many of its leading lights continued to assume that though there might be local direction to history, say applying to one's nation or continent, there may be only aimless cycling at the level of the globe. See, this was the era during which circumnavigation was beginning to take hold. So they tended to assume that all novel inventions had already been invented elsewhere and elsewhere, and by implication will be discovered again should their civilization be lost or forgotten. Even Hobbes, when theorizing upon his transition from the state of nature or prehistory to that of the social contract, admitted, importantly, that he didn't believe there was a time when such a state was universally ascendant throughout the globe. This betrays an assumption that human history, again at the level of the globe, is simply the cycling of states exhaustively manifested throughout space, rather than the chronology of genuine firsts and irreversible losses sequenced throughout time. So, again, by this point in time, by the early modern period and the Renaissance, this horizon of history, very broadly speaking, of course, extended perhaps beyond one's nation, but didn't extend much further than one's continent or landmass. There's a good example in Francis Bacon. Of course, he's considered one of the major proponents of this modern idea of progress. He talks about European inventions, or what he thought were European inventions, such as the compass and gunpowder, but then said, well, who's to say they haven't been invented elsewhere? And he acknowledged that the Chinese had potentially invented it first. So with that evidence in hand, you could say, yes, well, maybe if we're inventing these new things here and now, but there's evidence that other people have previously invented them, well, probably everything, there's nothing new under the sun. Everything we're doing here and now has probably already happened. But from the 1600s onwards, geology had been consolidating as a mature science. The geological record of superposed strata, each containing different fossils, a ledger of the past, would seem clearly to imply direction. Nonetheless, for a while, many resisted, trying to resolve building evidence of systemic direction in time into cycles of wider directionless, repetition, and recurrence. Ahead of evidence to the contrary, naturalists tended to assume in this period that the evidences of excavation would eventually reveal a lack of directionality across deepest geohistory. So the French philosopher Benoît de Malet in 1727, he said, if we could dig down to the center of the globe, we would see the remains of several superposed worlds, entire cities, durable monuments, and everything we observe on the surface of the earth, bones of men and animals, and all that occurs in our present world. So this idea that if you just dig deep enough, you'll find evidence of recurrence. The presumption was the Earth's past had always looked roughly like the present. Disasters may have recurrently wiped the world clean, but civilization returns after each reset, following an identical path each time. Edmund Halley, the British scientist in 1694, said exactly this. He said, there may have been a preceding learned age prior to the previous planetary disaster, wherein possibly as many things may have been known as now, and perhaps many more. So, believing this, even global catastrophes have no lasting impact because everything lost inevitably, effortlessly will be regained. Everything remains reversible. Reasoning teleologically, Halley even conjectured that such life-resetting catastrophes at the planetary scale are for the benefit of the humanities that he believed are to succeed, somehow ensuring the well-being of the future world. Nonetheless, since at least 1700, scientists had been accumulating evidence of undeniable directionality in Earth's past, in the shape of vestiges of a beginning. As early as 1669, the geologist Nicholas Steno recorded strata free of all organic material, implying a period in Earth's history when animals and plants had not yet appeared, he concluded. Moreover, and perhaps more troublingly, there was no sign of fossilized humans within the lower beds. Candidates for ancient humans were soon proven to be mistaken, such as this giant salamander fossil, which was briefly mischaracterized as a prehistoric human. So, by putting a clear backward stop on previous human history, alongside implying the recency of all humanity within a much elder Earth system, this meant that it became much more plausible to suggest that not everything humanly achievable has already been achieved throughout an unbounded eternal past. This in turn fed into a sense that, rather than being a closed-off repeat of what's come before, the future ahead could also be open-ended, containing novel achievements as well as unprecedented challenges. Thus, rather than being made up of directionless returns, resets, and amnesias gyrating through boundless time, human history as a global whole could begin to gain an overarching shape, involving determinate firsts and unidirectional transitions between different states. Moreover, a bounded past neatly implied a bounded future, forcing people for the first time to confront humanity's dependency upon the allotted lifespan of the physical planet. Marquis de Condorcet in 1794 said the following: "The progress of human civilization has no other limit than the duration of the globe upon which nature has placed us, and so long as there are no changes as would no longer permit the human species to persevere." So this emerging awareness of the connection between the existence of the human project and the habitability of the planet Earth. So, in the eyes of the time, how long was left? The first quantitative estimate of future habitability on Earth, extrapolated from physical process and experiment rather than scriptural prophecy, was produced by the French polymath Georges Buffon in the 1770s. Theorizing that Earth was created from molten matter ejected from the sun, Buffon inferred it would eventually dissipate its internal heat and freeze, killing all life. Accordingly, he heated some miniature iron globes, then measured their cool-down times, scaling this up to the size of the planet to produce his planetary forecast. Very rudimentary, but he was the first to try and actually attempt to put some predictions on this. He predicted 75,000 years had passed and that there was 93,000 years left ahead. A completionist, Buffon even calculated the periods of habitability for all the other planets in the solar system, assuming, as everyone did at the time, that they would also be inhabited. And as you can see, this was before rounding had become fashionable in science. They're very specific numbers. So, the habitable planet had thus gained a definitive beginning and a bounded future, providing the ambit, the extremities within which human history could be understood as unfolding, and as unfolding in a way that, because of the boundedness, could admit of persistence, genuine firsts, and irreversible losses. Eventually, this would come to replace the default assumption that global human history unfolds and had always unfolded as a limitly reversible and retraceable process meandering through time immemorial. Because of this, there emerged a sense of time ahead, bounded yet capacious, within which novel things could be achieved and persistently accumulated. But by the same token, this also meant that what might be lost in the event of planetary disaster could also begin to become articulable. So, by this point, let's say the early Enlightenment, the horizon of history had started circumscribing our planet as a physical entity. Nonetheless, contingency didn't yet enter the picture. Buffon himself once speculated what would happen if all life was wiped out globally. He wrote, "Let us suppose for a moment that all currently existing individuals should be stricken with death at the same instant. Buffon imagined that after this, there could not fail to be reproduced a new living nature. He said, this replacement of living nature would soon exhibit the same general plan of organization and the same varieties in the particular forms." So, why did Buffon assume this? The answer is because there was not yet, in the 1770s, any clear understanding of how species originate. such that there could be no grasp of what precisely is lost when their populations are decimated to the last member. There was no consensus that, once lost, species are gone forever. Many assumptions regarding the origination of species prior to Darwin actively obstructed grasping this truth. Going back centuries, one very prevalent theory held that each species pre-exists all its manifestations as invisible seeds diffuse universally throughout the atmosphere. These were assumed to be indestructible, i.e. they always have existed and always will. All that was needed, it was believed, were welcoming conditions, and the seeds would simply germinate into fully adaptive species without needs of parents or precursors. This means that a species can persist even if it has no currently living members. Such a theory makes the origin of species effortless, in that it lacks any time span or effort for origination, because this bypasses all the steps we now know are required to be traced through from simpler to less simple forms in order to forge a complex lifeway. There's no stringency nor multiplicity of prior states the world needs to have passed through for species to pass from inexistence to existence in this theory. The corollary of this is assuming that if a population dies out here and now, it's hard to see what would obstruct it from later appearing elsewhere. In the earlier 1700s, this argument was rallied to explicitly deny the irreversibility of extinction. Again, Benoit de Malet, the French philosopher, he wrote, "There are few countries in which characteristic species of animals have not disappeared, but these species which we know have vanished from Earth certainly survive, as their seeds still occur in the air surrounding it, and therefore could reappear any day." As late as 1819, the influential German biologist Lorenz Oken conjectured that humanity was first generated in such a way, gestated from sea sludge in the sea shallows without descending from prior forms. He even speculated sincerely as to how the first generation of children fed and fended for themselves, given there were no parents to show them the ropes. And this is an illustration that Oken handily provided of human embryos emerging from slime. But put simply, belief in the spontaneous generation of complex things without the need of prior histories neuters the consequences of their eradication. Because there's no stringency of states the universe must retrace to produce identical or similarly complex classes of entities again. Falsifying this presupposition that an annihilated species could return required the testimony of the fossil record, wherein lost fauna never return, and not just on one landmass or continent, but spanning all of them. This, of course, is precisely what scientists would begin piecing together from the mid-1700s onwards. By 1800, the scientific community had come to accept the reality of irreversible extinction. This started with the unearthing of Pleistocene megafaunal mammals like mastodon and mammoths, and by 1830, people had started to uncover dinosaurs. And so by this time, a sequence was beginning to be accepted, a succession of fauna over Earth time, with earlier forms more unfamiliar and later forms more closely resembling those extant today. Naturalists hypothesized an initial era of fish, then an era of reptiles, followed by today's era of mammals. So again, very rudimentary, but this was the first theorization of these large epochs in directional sequence across Earth history. Nonetheless, the causes behind this faunal succession remained unclear. Many simply assumed that each era's fauna were fresh creations, that they aren't descended from creatures of prior periods, nor are related to them in any material way. Some, as late as the 1840s and 50s, so the decade prior to Darwin's origin, argued that not a single organism has ever passed offspring between these past epochs of the Earth. They held instead that each time the planet is wiped entirely clean of life by some cataclysm, before entirely unrelated novel animals are simply called into existence entirely from scratch, whether by divine intervention or nature's inherent overflowing creativity. Today, we now recognize that the smallest possible number of steps required to assemble a complex mammal, a human or a kangaroo, from unorganized matter entirely from scratch and without the help of pre-existing parents, is something on the order of 4 billion years of uninterrupted accumulative evolution. That is, the shortest pathway to the biosphere's current richness demands an ancestry billions of years deep. But if you don't see this, assuming, contrarily, something as exquisite as an entire ecosystem can simply be forged afresh each time the world is wiped clean, it's much harder to see the weight of what might be lost in planetary disaster. So, we now know species are historical entities. They cannot simply spawn independently of myriad prior states of the world holding true. This is why, should they be lost, they cannot effortlessly reappear. It was, of course, Darwin who allowed the world to see this. He demonstrated that complex lifeways are only ever wrought by stringent, long-winding histories. Accordingly, members of a species cannot spawn anywhere, anytime, effortlessly, because they need a connection to a shared past in the form of parents and countless ancestors. Darwin was conclusive. He wrote, "When a species has once disappeared from the face of the earth, we have reason to believe that the same identical form never reappears, for the link of generations has been broken." Organic complexity thus becomes a kind of stock, built only over time. It doesn't just require one prior state to hold, it requires myriads in unbroken chains of cumulative inheritance stretching back across aeons. Without the shortcut of already procreating parents, there is no way of skipping these steps. Solely upon apprehending this could it become truly apparent how historically consequential any destruction or loss of that planetary stock of biodiversity might be. So, by the 1860s, species, Earth's entire family of life, was now included within this horizon as its products, contingent and destructible. But how much longer did life on Earth have left? What further development and diversification might be possible? Answering this question, now in the Victorian epoch, involved estimating how long it had taken for life to arrive at its current grandeur and diversity, so as to gauge how much further diversification could be accumulated in the time left ahead. By the mid-1800s, due to the birth of thermodynamics, which mathematically models the flow of energy and heat, the question of Earth's future habitability was, by now, explicitly understood to hinge upon the sun's remaining lifespan. John Tyndall in 1863 explicated this. He said, "Look at the integrated energies of our world, the stored power of our coal fields, our winds and rivers, our fleets, armies and guns. What are they? They are all generated by a portion of the sun's energy." So, how long left? Mid-century physicists provide the first hypothetical model for how the sun was formed and produces its heat. The new mathematics of thermodynamics was quickly used to estimate how long the sun had already been burning and to forecast how many years of sunlight might be left ahead. William Thomson, later Lord Kelvin, produced the first prediction for the future output of the sun in 1854. He said, "Sunlight cannot last as at present for 300,000 years." Again, their model of how the sun produces heat was wrong, but at least they were trying, like Buffon earlier, to put some numbers and to try and, figure this stuff out. By the end of the 1800s, physicists calculate and converge on the low tens of millions for Earth's habitable future. For example, Charles Augustus Young, in 1881, predicted the sun won't continue to give sufficient heat to support life on Earth for 10 million years from the present time. So, by this point, the past and future of the whole solar system had thus become large but bounded. Yet, just as the ancients and the early moderns could point beyond their own polis or landmass in order to gesture beyond history's acknowledged and accepted horizon to the region wherein things will comfortably repeat and recoup, so too could the Victorians point beyond the solar system to other stars and systems, and conjecture that regardless of humanity's fate or follies here on Earth, there will always and forever be abundant other humanities spread throughout the limitless cosmos. Demonstrating this well, August Blanqui, who Nietzsche based his eternal return idea on, said in the 1870s, "The starry expanses are the future regions of our immortality. The number of our body doubles is infinite in time and space." So assuming that the universe has no bounds in time or in space, is eternal and infinite, by logical necessity, there will be numberlessness, doubles of us spread throughout that infinity. Such assumption was almost universal, and it had been since the Copernican revolution back in the 1600s. This assumption allows one to view the extinction of life on Earth as comparatively trivial, as only a local tragedy, because we can rest assured that elsewhere in the infinite universe there will always be, in the words of the popular French astronomer Camille Flammarion, other suns, other earths, other humanities, and other minds are successors in the universal and eternal history. And the amount of comments like this from this period is actually quite remarkable. There's an amazing quote from Kant that I included in my last book, where he says the destruction of our planet doesn't really matter because there'll be repeats of it everywhere throughout space. So such belief was attached to related assumptions about the origination of life. Indeed, many theorized that in a cosmos without a beginning, life itself also need not be historical, in the sense of never having properly originated anywhere or anywhen, such that it can also never properly have an end. This took the form of the theory of panspermia, popular during the decade straddling 1900, which argued that life doesn't originate or emerge at a certain place or time, but simply circulates unendingly from system to system, planet to planet, and always has done in the form of what they called cosmic spores or astroplankton, which is a great word. So August Weismann, a German biologist in the 1880s, fleshed this out. He said, panspermia states that life can only arise from life and has always so arisen, and thus organic beings are eternal like matter itself. Moreover, panspermia meant that on average and over time, the amount of life in this eternal cosmos will remain invariant. One planet may die, but another will be germinated, and these average out in the longest term. Svante Arrhenius, Swedish climate scientist, spelt this out in 1907 when he said, "Circulation has neither beginning nor end, and life may exist and continue forever and undiminished." So, reaching the final stage of the expansion of these horizons here. So, but then, in shocking contradiction to all this, in the 1920s and 30s, observational and theoretical evidence begins building that the universe is expanding, that galaxies are receding away from us and accelerating as they recede. Extrapolating backwards, this implies a time zero, or a beginning. Previous physics assumed this steady-state eternal cosmos, but now the entire universe appeared to be gaining a finite history. This led to, naturally, this led to first theorization that the cosmos began with some kind of primordial explosion. Georges Lemaitre, the French scientist who originated this idea, wrote, "The evolution of the universe can be compared to a display of fireworks that has just ended. Some few red wisps, ashes, and smoke. Standing on a well-chilled cinder, we see the slow fading of the suns, and we try to recall the vanished brilliance of the origin of worlds." It wasn't long before this radical theory started winning over influential physicists, and it wasn't much longer until they started extruding its entailments. George Gamow, the Russian-American scientist in 1941, arrived at this. He wrote, "Not so long ago, one of the favorite explanations of the appearance of life on our planet was the panspermia hypothesis. But this becomes rather senseless in the light of modern knowledge, that the stars themselves are not eternal and were born. This physical creation of the universe must have taken place during the epoch preceding the formation of our Earth and other planetary systems, and since it is obvious that at that time no life could exist anywhere in the universe, the problem of the origin of life has to be faced anew." Around the same time, there were various important breakthroughs in origin of life research. Through the 1920s and 30s, the Russian biochemist Alexander Oparin became the first to pose life's origin as a specifically and self-consciously historical question. Previously, it was assumed life either didn't originate and simply eternally circulated, aka panspermia, or that it was constantly emerging from non-living matter and that this was unremarkable and continuous, i.e. spontaneous generation. Both theories remove any significant factor of time from the equation. Oparin reframed the problem by asking whether radically different atmospheric conditions in Earth's past could have allowed a gradual build-up of organic molecules from inorganic compounds. This brought history back into the picture. The reason we don't see life emerging from non-life today is because these special conditions no longer hold. Following Oparin's conjectures, in 1952, the American chemist Stanley Miller replicated these conjectured young Earth conditions in the lab, managing, in the process, to the surprise of everyone, synthesize organic monomers. This lent credence to this new theory of abiogenesis, the idea that life arose from non-living matter, potentially only once in the past through a cumulative process. This new theory implied life was not some timeless and thus universal phenomenon, but the product of a specific confluence of past events. Further research implied that the emergence of replicating cells may well have been highly improbable. Or, in other words, it isn't inevitable whenever the conditions are conducive, as both panspermia and spontaneous generation had previously held. This began to imply that life, rather than being cosmically abundant across time and space, is product of historical happenstance, the result of a series of flukes, potentially. Thus, it might well be cosmically scarce, perhaps even unique. Further, in 1964, Penzias and Wilson, two American astronomers, accidentally discovered the cosmic microwave background radiation. This is the echo from the Big Bang, and it was received as overwhelming evidence for this new theory. This was tantamount to empirical confirmation that the observable cosmos itself had a beginning. This had subtle yet profound ramifications on the view of life's place and potential within the wider cosmos. The American anthropologist Lauren Isley put this best in 1953. He wrote, 50 years ago, there was widely held belief in the infinity of time. While old star systems burned out and died, new systems emerged. The idea of an eternal universe allowed the possibility of the spores of life drifting from wreckage of burnt-out systems to systems beginning anew, and an infinity of time in which man might arise again and again. He continued, but we have now acquired the growing suspicion that we live in an expanding universe which had an incredible beginning and threatens to have an even more fantastic end. Time, in the only sense we can know it, is limited. The same life does not come again, he wrote. The same hands will never twice build the golden cities of this world. The time stream, the onpouring, whatever we may call it, is far more original than this. In other words, in a universe with a beginning and a finite lifespan, no matter how large, it's no longer feasible to fall back on the assumption that, regardless of what happens here and now, there always will be other humanities and biospheres identical to our own elsewhere and elsewhen. So, should we destroy things here and now, then these unique and unrepeatable products of past history are likely gone from the entire universe forever after. Yet, still, and arriving towards the conclusion, there remained one stubborn assumption, obstructing fully appreciating the practical force of this realization. Going all the way back to Darwin, there persisted overriding assumption that something sapient was the inevitable outcome of macroevolution. Thus, if humanity died out here and now, then something like it would eventually re-emerge and resume sapience's project, so to speak, on Earth or perhaps elsewhere. Darwin himself had been convinced that, in the main, species predominantly are pushed to extinction by their more adaptive descendants and competitors. In other words, it is a question of bad design, not bad luck. For this reason, Darwin himself downplayed the role of planetary cataclysms that could decimate indiscriminately, wiping out even the most successful lineages. He maintained that what looked like mass extinction events in the fossil record were just distortions of our incomplete data. This underwrote a thoroughly progressivist view of macroevolution, where, in Darwin's influential words, as natural selection works solely by and for the good of each being, all corporeal and mental endowments will tend to progress towards perfection. Of course, perfection was assumed to resemble something rational and humanoid. In an 1860 letter, Darwin went so far as to conjecture that rational beings would always inevitably re-evolve after being extinguished. He wrote, "If every vertebrate were destroyed throughout the world, except the reptiles, then after millions of ages, today's lizards would eventually become highly developed on a scale equal to mammals and possibly more intellectual." Most of Darwin's followers for much of the 1900s followed this lead. Well into the mid-1900s, there was widespread assumption that extinction largely befell decrepit or spent lineages of life, such that despite detours and delays, all macroevolution inexorably tends towards humanoid perfection. Extinction, therefore, was self-servingly assumed to only befall the deserving. This was applied particularly, sometimes with surprising spite, to the dinosaurs. Well into the mid-1900s, the stereotypical view was that they died out due to sluggishness or stupidity and were thus mercifully pruned from the world so that we superior and intellectual mammals could take over. In the words of Charles R. Knight, who himself dedicated his entire life to illustrating dinosaurs, so he should have been a fan if anyone was, but he too dismissed them with spite, saying, "The world was to grow away from these slow-moving dunces, and little warm-blooded beings, furry, alert, and aggressive, were to supersede them." Though some dissented, it nonetheless remained common to assume that something like humanity was the inevitable outcome of macroevolution, here or elsewhere in the cosmos. At the 1969 centenary of Origin of Species, one evolutionist confidently pronounced the following. He said, "Hence I see the development of higher types of mammals, and to some extent of a being like man, as necessitated." And that's an illustration from a Carl Sagan book of his speculation on what would have happened to the dinosaurs if the asteroid didn't hit. They would have turned into us. Which is probably even more dismissive than saying that they were stupid, that they would have to become us to redeem themselves. Anyway, unsurprisingly, such assumption was applied not only to Earth's future, but also to exoplanets, to star systems beyond the solar system. During the Cold War, indeed, probably because of the Cold War, it was often stated that should humanity atomically self-destruct on Earth, there would at least be other rational beings elsewhere who would be able to give the world riddle another shot. Bluntly, calling humanity necessitated is the opposite of accepting that it could easily suffer a similar fate to the dinosaurs. In general, assuming extinction only happens to the deserving was not only self-serving, but it also obstructed sensitivity that it can befall lifeways which could otherwise have gone on, flourishing and diversifying. Worse, it enabled the mollification and the rationalization of humanity's wholesale destruction of global ecosystems. But such a view would be dismantled in the later decades of the 1900s. As the 1980s opened, conclusive evidence began building, implying the dinosaurs were decimated by a chancy collision. Having been downplayed since Darwin, to the point of investigation being stymied, this went on to reveal the huge importance of chance, contingency, and therefore mass extinction in shaping life's history. Suddenly, it became highly plausible the dinosaurs didn't die out from bad genes or bad design, but from sheer bad luck. A comet, after all, cannot be rationalized away as the handmaiden of progress, nor as adaptation's invisible hand. This had three profound but subtle consequences. First, the new view implied that, should the asteroid not have chanced upon Earth, we cannot assume that anything humanoid would ever have emerged. Or, in the 1983 words of Stanislav Lem, none of us would be here if there hadn't been 66 million years ago, a catastrophe in the form of an enormous 3.5 to 4 trillion ton meteorite. We are, he concluded, the fluke product of the roulette wheels that are galaxies. Second, by demonstrating how the marks of contingency cast their legacies deep throughout evolutionary history, the impact hypothesis made much more salient the impacts of present-day human action upon life's further future. Suggestions that we are altering everything to come in ways which wouldn't otherwise have come to pass gained force. Tellingly, it was precisely around the same time, in the 1980s, that prominent scientists such as Richard Leakey first began asserting that we are living during what he called the sixth mass extinction, triggered by human activity. For Leakey and others, it was clearly a recognition of the newfound role of contingents in previous mass extinctions, which led him and others to insisting we take responsibility today. Indeed, prior generations of scientists from Darwin onwards had made excuses for anthropogenic ecocide, explaining it away as part of nature's inexorable search for the fittest. Imputing culpability for a wrongdoing, after all, assumes that things could have played out differently had the wrongdoer acted differently. But long-held progressivist assumption had enabled prior intellectuals to pardon anthropogenic extinction. Again, ahead of strong contrary evidence, people were less than willing to extend genuine contingency far beyond human affairs, up to evolutionary and planetary scales. But the evidence of impact forced this extension. And third, and finally, the new view of mass extinction toppled any residual assurance an animal as adaptive and dominant as Homo sapiens wouldn't be succumbing to extinction anytime soon. It demonstrated that even the most dominant and preeminent animals can perish, leaving no progenitors nor hope of a replay, entirely due to lottery or folly, rather than bad design or decrepitude. For these reasons, it's probably not a mere coincidence that, as Stephen Jay Gould liked to point out, research into the late Cretaceous impact dovetailed into the first serious research on the severity of nuclear war, for the mechanisms of global climate fallout are rather identical. Gould wrote, "A recognition of the very phenomena, i.e. impact winter, that made our evolution possible by exterminating the previously dominant dinosaurs might actually help to save us from joining those magnificent beasts in contorted poses among the strata of the earth." So, to conclude and try and wrap this up. So, where does this all leave us? By making history cosmic, there arrives the possibility of making cosmic history. Or, in other words, in a universe that is thoroughly historical, one that admits of directional processes at all scales, it is at least plausible that sapience may one day impart some kind of meaningfully lasting influence upon its cosmic environment. Given the expansion of the horizon of history to cosmic catchments, it becomes at least conceptually plausible that we are living in that cosmic epoch before which life has spilled beyond its birthplace so as to have a truly historic impact, perhaps to tip the wider cosmos from its currently abiotic and sterile state into something richer, more vibrant, and more organic. Yet, this invites the question, has anyone else already made the attempt? Eiseley, again, put it best back in the 1950s, in the wake of the taking hold of the Big Bang Theory. He wrote, "Since we now talk endlessly of space rockets, it is no surprise that this thinking yields the obverse of the coin, that the rocket or its equivalent may have come first to us from the outside. Surely, in the infinite wastes of time, in the lapses of suns and the wane of systems, the passage, if it were possible, would have been achieved. But the bright projectile has not been found." But, he continued, "the present theory of the expanding universe has made time as we know it no longer infinite. If the entire universe was created in a single explosive instant a few billion years ago, there has not been sufficient time for all things to occur, even behind the star shoals of the outer galaxies. In the light of this fact, it is therefore now conceivable that there may be nowhere in space a mind superior to our own." Well, yeah. Not many years afterwards, Eiseley's question was put to empirical test for the first time. The opening of the 1960s, that is, saw the launch in earnest of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or SETI. Hopes were high that initial searches would reveal a noisy galaxy filled with other intelligences, perhaps more historied than us and wise, and happy to communicate the hard-won wisdoms that they had learnt. Again, this is the Cold War. People were hoping that they could give us the international relations wisdom to survive. But SETI found nothing, only cosmic silence. Nothing, of course, has been found since. Not one sign of cosmic mind. The uneasy conclusion was swiftly reached, one which still today troubles those who ponder the silent sky. Either something about the feat of spreading life beyond its birth planet is impossible, either materially or due to some inherent transience of technological intelligences like our own, or, for better or worse, we are amongst the first to possibly have the potential to effect such a momentous outcome. And in a truly historic cosmos, you cannot rely on an infinitude of future opportunities, nor can you take mistakes back. All options, to put it lightly, are troubling. So, where does this leave us? To sum up, as we've learned more about this world, we've increasingly come to accept that the statements, "nature never forgets," and "it could all have been otherwise," are true and apply at increasingly titanic scales. In tandem, this has progressively led to deeper appreciation of the sheer contingency of everything that makes us who and what we are. Not only is life itself the product of unrepeating and chancy events in the ancient past, so too are all its diverse species, and in particular, that strange twig of the tree of life that accidentally developed sapiens. It took orienting ourselves within cosmic history as a whole to discover this most intimate and, in my opinion, fundamental truth about who we are, where we came from, and where we might be going. Where once it was assumed we were common or inevitable, now we seem lonely and fragile. But as orienting creatures, knowing that, or beliefs about the facts, never isn't also a form of knowing how, or some belief about our practical priorities. The brilliant paleontologist again, Stephen Jay Gould, put it best, reflecting on modern science's message of the cosmic contingency of Homo sapiens. He wrote, "Make of the conclusion what you will. Some find the prospect depressing. I have always regarded it as exhilarating and a source of both freedom and consequent moral responsibility." Regardless, one troubling entailment stubbornly remains. As sapient beings, we are the potentially unique product of a thoroughly historic cosmos. But this also means there is a chance, no matter how outlandishly small, that one day, for better or worse, our descendants might make cosmic history. Again, by making history cosmic, the possibility of making cosmic history arises. What seems sure is that we no longer live in an eternal universe where everything that can happen has already happened and will happen again. We can no longer sit on our Copernican laurels. Mind might yet shape its environment at scales unprecedented. What this means practically for us humble earthlings, we cannot yet know. Whether it means we are ripe with future opportunity to green the galaxy and vivify the firmament, or to otherwise squander what might be the universe's one chance to nudge itself away from its abiotic and inorganic default, or to spread, perhaps with all the best intentions in the world, an irreparable calamity across the stars, is a matter for the future to decide. Or perhaps it means scarce anything at all, and these are just the stammerings of a simian that is a fluke of history, superciliously proud of the apparent cosmic uniqueness of its so-called sapience. Thank you.
Any questions or comments, please?
Need a minute.
Hello, thank you for the talk. You mentioned Stanislaw name in Stanislaw's name in your presentation, and I'm reminded of the three-body problem and Left Hand of Darkness, sort of these moments of like coincidence with, life outside of Earth. And I saw that you had also written an article about the history of utopia. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of science fiction or sort of like imaginative works as sort of factoring into this process of like reframing history, and sort of what's the role of fiction. And you spent a lot of time talking about like scientific pursuits and not necessarily like fiction. So yeah, I was wondering if you could sort of elaborate on that.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question and equally expansive. So I'm not sure I'll be able to do it justice, but I mean, my sense is that when it comes to these world reorganizing discoveries, yes, of course, it's often science fiction or just fiction that elaborates those kind of furthermost entailments first, because scientists tend to, and for good reason, care a lot about credibility, and so so yeah, for example, I mean, this is much earlier than Stanislav Lem, etc. But I was talking a bit about these discoveries about fossils and prehistoric life in the Enlightenment. You get some scientists here and there saying things about how humanity might also suffer the same fate, but the first person to actually put that speculative scenario and flesh it out and make it into a narrative was, of course, Mary Shelley, The Last Man. Mm-hmm. Byron as well offered his poem Darkness. So yeah, it's often left to fiction authors to really think these things through. And so this kind of not to trivialize, but like the galaxy brain stuff towards the end. It's like I think the Fermi question and this idea of cosmic silence is like a genuine scientific problem. It's a genuine philosophical problem, because no matter how you look at it, something about our fundamental assumptions about this universe and our place within it are like, some of them are radically off. We don't know which one. But yeah, again, it was like, it was left to science fiction authors like Lem to really take it seriously. I mean, it gets the name Fermi from Enrico Fermi, as a throwaway at a lunch at Los Alamos and the Manhattan Project, being like, well, where are all the UFOs? Like, haven't they visited us yet? But that was a throwaway question. No one really took it that much more seriously. It was left to Lem to really flesh it out, and now there are like academic papers written by physicists on this thing, and they often quote Lem. So yeah, like the science fiction is this kind of laboratory for fleshing out these possibilities and the possibility space. All I can say is that I completely agree that science fiction authors are, and again, just authors in general are often willing to go to see where these entailments lead in a way that, potentially the scientists are, slightly more afraid of. I mean, even thinking like Thomas Hardy, right? Like, he had some really like quite radical things to say about like human contingency. And us as a cosmic accident, and that was from him reading Darwin. But Darwin, never went that far. So yeah, no. All I can do is agree with you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm not a student here, and I haven't really done my homework, so please bear with me. But what you said, I mean, it seems like you have identified a few different attitudes towards human extinction. Not only, I mean, our horizon of history, but attitudes. So there's the religious sort of viewing extinction as a sort of a cause for jubilation, as the sort of consummation of purpose of life on this base existence towards the transcendence and so on. And then the assuaging sort of, life can still continue somehow, somewhere. And other, even like, the end would be spectacular. I think at some point, one of the quotes you mentioned. And I just wanted to ask about what you called your cosmic pragmatism, which is, how does it fit within those postures? What is the existential posture of this cosmic? And specifically, I want to ask about whose extinction, because there is now all this, it's actually quite popular to talk about populating other planets, and if you want to call it maybe man-made panspermia, you know what I mean? Like we're gonna spread life beyond Earth, and it's us, and it's our extinction that we're trying to avoid, and we don't really care too much about the biosphere as much as, I mean, there is a tension there between our extinction and the thought of life on the planet as some sort of equilibrium. I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question again. Thank you. And again, it's very it's multi-tiered, so I'll try and do my best. On the or popularized it, they weren't as anthropocentric as, you know, some people now tend to be. I think of Freeman Dyson. He just wanted life. He didn't really care if it was human or not. Like he's the one that I borrow the phrase "greening the galaxy" from, and he, you know, thought of the idea of creating like plants that could, like, you know, survive in you know, the void of space to spread life. But yeah, no, I mean the discussion on that front. There is. I haven't really seen many. I don't think I've seen anyone. Discuss, well, so people do discuss the ethics of, say, what would it mean to take, to like seed a planet with life already on it, and, you know, there's something that seems ethically dubious about that, right? But there's even a deeper thing where, you know, spreading Earth originating life. Also, there's like an invisible opportunity cost there, because you're potentially stopping other biospheres that don't yet have life but might produce it later on, right? So, you know, we hardly know anything, and so, like, you know, and this, I guess, might lead me on to answering the aspect of your question about, you know, what is this stance of cosmic pragmatism? I guess it's, yeah, you know, we don't know anything, so anyone's arriving at, like, you know, kind of firm practical conclusions. Yeah, you know, the older I get, the more suspicious I am of anyone saying that, you know, this is what must be done. But at the same time, you know, I feel that doesn't mean that we should kind of recoil from these, like, big picture questions and, you know, kind of, because again, that's also another form of assuaging or nonchalance or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, and I guess in terms of just the pragmatism, yeah, it's like, you know, there's a lot of the inspiration tacitly is coming from Charles Sanders Peirce, and he, you know, he has this really interesting definition of truth as, you know, the end of inquiry, like this idea of, if inquiry was allowed to pan out indefinitely, this kind of answer to this question of the world riddle, upon which everyone couldn't help but agree. But what's really good about that is he was very careful to say this is not constitutive, it's not predestined, it's not like concrete, it's a hope. Like, we must just hope that there is this kind of answer to everything, you know. There is, you know, this kind of a point at which everyone would have to agree, and all it does is guide and propel all of our local inquiry. And so, yeah, like, I think that's, you know, with I was borrowing from Frank Ramsey, another kind of pragmatically inspired philosopher, with the strawberry thing. You know, this idea that, like, think if humanity as a species went to its deathbed with no one eating a strawberry because everyone just happened to believe they were poisonous. We think there's something perverse about that because they hadn't turned over that stone. So this is kind of what I mean, is like, we don't know the answers, we don't know the practical upshots of these things in advance of putting these questions to nature. But because of that, like, we have to go wherever inquiry takes us. And so,
even in practice, so do we have to eat the proverbial strawberry when it comes to, like, terraforming and also I want to ask about transhumanism, whatever that means. Is that also another way of, because for example, by populating other planets by default, I mean, the assumption is the human organism would be changed by the change of its environment. So again, like, is transforming life on Earth as a way of sort of to meet the conditions that we have already created. Is that a form of cosmic pragmatism, or?
I'm not sure. I guess, I mean, one thing I'd say is that, you know, life on Earth isn't stable, and there are probably ways in which the human organism is going to be changed by what we are doing currently to the climate. So, yeah, terraforming isn't just what happens to your environment, because, the environment will happen to you in turn. So, I kind of propositioned that. Yeah, on the question of, is there a demand to go to other planets? I think we just have to have that conversation. Again, I don't think we have an answer. It could be awful for reasons that we don't yet know. It could be a brilliant thing if done the right way. But we should have a discussion about it. And when I say we, just kind of the public sphere, because I much prefer that than someone who's got a big wallet to just go and do it. So again, these kind of the world is burning, right? Things are awful. There's genocides. There's climate change. All this stuff. That we need to have these discussions about these bigger picture things as well. And yeah, I would like to. I don't know. Yeah, I would like to have those conversations. I don't see it as a zero-sum game where you're taking away attention from one thing or the other, because these things matter as well. And yeah, like I say, I wouldn't like it to be done in the wrong way. And again, we barely know anything. Looking at the history of ideas, it's a history of ignorance. You go back to a century ago. There's a thing I wrote recently. It's a good example of people just arriving. They have a bit of knowledge and they arrive at this big practical prescription and are really confident about it. This thing I wrote recently was on climate change. And so understanding that CO2 warms the global climate, and that human industry was putting CO2 in the atmosphere, that understanding was arrived at in the early 1900s. But in advance of all the other things that we now know about what that entails and the complexities and everything, most scientists were just like, oh, that's good. They were like, okay, a warmer climate would mean arable land in Siberia, and that could support the growing population of the Earth. And Svante Arrhenius, the Swedish scientist who I quoted, he was like, this would be great. Let's burn more coal. And there was an American scientist that I found, an engineer actually, and he was like, okay, let's get all of the nations of the world to unite in agreement that they're going to just set fire to all of their coal seams, and just let them burn. Just let them burn, because then the Earth will warm, and we will return to this Edenic state where there's going to be farmyards in the Arctic. And everyone will be happy and well fed. No one had really thought of the fact that this would completely make much of the developing world uninhabitable. People didn't think of that. The people that were arguing this anyway, they didn't think of the fact that obviously this climate is a really complicated thing, and messing with it in that way could lead to all these cascading effects, and And so I think that we're probably in the same position when it comes to the current things that we're talking about as these big picture issues of what would it mean to spread life? We're probably missing all of these really crucial considerations that completely change that practical idea of would it be good, would it be bad, or something anywhere in between. Does that somewhat answer your question? Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's a really brilliant question, yeah.
I just wanted to ask if you think all of what we've done as a humanity over history to understand our origin, so everything you've just explained is just out of mere curiosity or out of a sense of self-preservation, because I feel like everything we've done is just to understand if we're here as a first time and if we're going to stay. And as he mentioned, we want to spread this life. We want to be the originators. So is it just the instinct that a human has to defend themselves against a certain threat that is just spanned out across the whole humanity as a whole species, because we know for a fact that each individual doesn't really care about the continuation of the species, as we saw with basically what happens a few generations ago, where people did know what would happen if they continued with the CO2 emissions, and they just continued with it. So we know that this is really rare to care about your own species. So is it just a self-preservation that they feel like they must do, or?
Yeah. Again, wow. Yeah, that's an amazing question. I mean, I think that in a sense, you know, self-preservation or subsistence is the origination of, you know, most of our goals and desires. But I really don't think that everything that we do is reducible merely to that desire. You know, we can aim for things that aren't just the propagation of the human, you know, line. And one thing I would point to is that, you know, I'm not sure if everyone would agree, but I think that it's tragic when any species dies. You know, like equally tragic in a really important way. And so that has nothing to do with human preservation, you know, and I mean this in like an intrinsic sense, not in an instrumental sense, because you sometimes get arguments against, you know, anthropogenic extinction because we might be losing some instrumental value that, you know, this fungus has some medicinal property, but we won't be able to use that now because it's gone. No, I like think really in a really intrinsic sense, like that, you know, the stuff I was gesturing to in particular with the stuff around Darwin and, you know, what evolution really means is, yeah, I think there's something intrinsically valuable about a lineage of life that, you know, has existed uninterrupted going back all the way to 4 billion years ago, or whenever, slightly less than that, when presumably the last universal common ancestor existed. That thing I was saying about, you know, these steps between unorganized matter and that thing existing, they're astonishing and confer admiration, dignity, value, whatever you want to call it, on that thing. And so, yeah, that's definitely not just like arriving from like a desire for human preservation. I guess you could then say, well, it's just the desire for preserving life. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that is a unadmirable goal. Yeah, I'm not sure that's really answered your question. Yeah, that's my opinion. Yeah. So I think that, yeah, not everything is reducible to self-preservation. And, you know, in my previous book, I tried to kind of make this moral imperative, to like extract it from the fact that we can now conceive of our extinction. And that means that, you know, because, you know, in my view, value is something that, you know, is secreted by the histories of a rational being. It's like in some sense produced by rational creatures. You know, there isn't some kind of inherent value outside of our interactions with the world and each other, such that, you know, without us, potentially the universe wouldn't have value in it, and therefore it's like our imperative to survive. I really don't agree with that anymore, because it's, yeah, like it becomes quite authoritarian in the sense that you're like, we're obliged to exist, and I just don't think that's right. But yeah, at the same time though, I think that there is something to say in the fact that each of us does have that like unbroken ancestry going back to the very beginning of life, and, you know, for that to all end, regardless of whether we're talking about humans or kangaroos or koalas or, you know, the most insignificant amphibian, I think that it's a tragedy. So yeah, that's my opinion. Thanks.
I have a question. No, you go.
It's not a question, it's a comment. I don't really know if it's I mean, I would have to think about it more, but I think the question is, I guess when you say this, I mean, in a sense, it seems like what you need is a kind of an account of contingency for this that may not just be kind of a Kantian account. I mean, there seems to be something here that has to be, I mean, what you call authoritarian, or the limit of, let's say, the previous account that you had, maybe it's kind of a Kantian limit. And I say this, I mean, okay, I mean, that's why it's not really a question. It's a really long, maybe later, but I mean, it has to do with, yeah, I mean, so the idea is that, like, you know, the thought carries on without seeing contingency that is already at work. Like, in a way that what you are trying to provide is a kind of an account of history, or a kind of a concept of history that is at work in a way that overlays or does not allow for the contingency that is already at work, so that's retroactively figured out from the position of what I would imagine would be kind of an epistemology that can't just be part of the kind of modern, not just kind of physics and biology, it's crucially mathematics that makes possible, right? The idea of the expansion of the universe. I mean, there's a lot of complex mathematics involved in this kind of model, right? So, yeah, I mean, so I suppose I think, you're asking a huge, I think what you're proposing asks big questions to both philosophy and science in a way. I do think psychoanalysis may have a lot to offer here, but I'm not going to get into that. But I mean, I think in the sense that, the questions it asks to philosophy have to do with certain limits, I think, to transcendental idealism, or like to Kant's account here, and then maybe in relationship to science, like what kind of epistemology, what kind of science of error or contingency can we think about? What kind of because we can't just assume that the scientific episteme is somehow, you're synthesizing this, but we can't assume that there's a kind of a scientific mindset that actually, whatever, that is actually putting this together. You're doing this work as a kind of with a conceptual history and the intellectual history that you're doing. So no, I mean, I just wanted as a comment. I mean, just this kind of where I see this kind of going in a way, or or the questions that raised. It's really a comment.
Yeah. No, I mean, that brings all kinds of things to mind, and I do want to hear what psychoanalysis has to offer. Absolutely, but yeah, I guess so. I guess this question of pragmatism, it is kind of obscure how it connects to any of this, but I suppose. This scientific episteme is like, you can disagree with it, you can try and see inhabit other kind of ways of looking at things, but, if we choose to inhabit it, it, does seem to give us good practical traction on, the things that are happening, like causes and effects, and etc. And, these questions are also huge, but I think they do always come down to this sense of putting into relief agency. So, if we live in a universe wherein our best knowledge of how it works at the widest scales implies that things can go in different directions, then that's a universe where an agency can happen, regardless of scale. So, what my gambit in telling a story, because history is always a story, it's always to a degree didactic, is just to edify this possibility of agency. If everything about us is contingent from the level of the potentially the molecules we're made of up to the societies we inhabit, then we can remake it anew. And it's very easy to forget that. We were discussing this beforehand, but it's very easy to forget that in the current state of things. And I'm not entirely confident we do live in that universe wherein everything is contingent or agency is a thing. But I want to make my bet on that being true, because that's, I think, the way to pragmatically act. If you want to, say if we did live in that universe and we thought that, no, we live in a deterministic universe, then that would lead to bad outcomes. And so, just to act as if we do have agency, I think does that make sense? It sounds a bit strange.
No, it does. I mean, it does. And I think, at least, from somewhere else, one could think that agency would have to be, you know, you could call it a subject, and there's all kinds of things that one could no, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's putting into relief how hard it was to figure out all this stuff, and just, you know, how many generations of people just, you know, unceasingly putting questions, often the wrong questions, sometimes the right ones, revising, you know, really difficult opinions to revise, like really, you know, deeply held opinions, and just accumulating all this knowledge and constellating it. Putting that into relief, I think, it shows that, you know, and again, I don't make this claim, it's too strong, but to try and explain where I'm coming from, if the default kind of pre-theoretical or ahead of evidence mode is kind of thinking fatalistically or deterministically, or, you know, beyond our own lives, we're not in control of anything, like the trend of like learning more about things beyond that scale has kind of proven, in my eyes, that, you know, those processes, or at least the conditions of possibility that allow processes such as agency do apply. And so, you know, then it becomes a question of like, how do we organize? How do we actually change things politically? And I don't have anything to say there. So yeah, you know, I'm being facetious, but yeah.
I have a question about, it's really about your title, about orienting ourselves, and what that actually, what it means in a pragmatic sense. You know, this orienting ourselves in the broadest possible sense, because as you emphasize, you know, you mentioned the term sapiens, which, you know, as you know, is coupled in the philosophers who use this term. You mentioned Sellers, but, you know, other, in a way, philosophers inspired by pragmatism, such as Brandom. The key contrast for them is between, you know, sapience or knowing, and sentience, which is just like awareness. And the issue is that if you're talking about, you know, sentience, like if anything with a nervous system, or if one kind of defines sentience in a kind of very broadly as, you know, life. Okay, anything living can be considered sentient in some very kind of attenuated sense. Then you've emphasized the contingency, the evolution of organic life is ceaselessly punctuated by contingency. And Gould emphasizes constantly how it's catastrophic. But Gould also emphasizes how, even if it's true that the historicity of organic life implies that there have to be kind of, you know, there are billions of years of, you know, for any kind of life form implies a history, but the contingency of evolution implies nothing about complexification or accumulation. So Gould, as you know, points out how even if, you know, most life on Earth is bacterial, okay, most it's the simplest, most kind of rudimentary organisms that predominate, and they're the least susceptible to to kind of destruction, precisely because they're so simple. And his point is that if you have, although there's a kind of there's a baseline of minimal complexity which is defined physically and chemically, that kind of baseline of minimal complexity implies no upward or kind of, you know, rightward trajectory of increasing complexification. And he says that evolution is like a drunkard's walk. There's a baseline of kind of minimal complexity, but as the deviation away from this minimal baseline is, there's nothing that kind of orients it. There's no orientation, okay? So and he points out that, so the fact that had the dinosaurs not been wiped out, the point is that it's not that they were maladapted. Nothing is more or less adapted. Everything is equally well adapted. Bacteria are as well adapted and probably better adapted than anything else because they're less vulnerable to kind of, catastrophic disruption, okay? So that implies that if the evolution of sentience is discontinuous and catastrophic, and there's no discernible trajectory at the level of like biological evolution, whereas sapience, history for sapience or for knowledge is about forging continuity. In other words, we develop we understand ourselves, we orient ourselves as sapient beings, as creatures who know and understand, by looking back to look ahead. But in looking back, and the philosophers you mentioned, they say, well, we always have to forge continuities. So even if the evolution of sapience, of human culture and knowledge, is also punctuated by contingency, nevertheless, the cognitive task, is to kind of see an underlying kind of pattern or a discernible kind of a rational order unfolding in this contingent. And Branham said it's always retrospective. You retrospectively see how something that seems arbitrary and contingent makes some kind of, knowledge or understanding kind of possible. So the point is that at the continuity, there has to be a continuity at the level of historical sapience. I mean, to have a historical sense, implies a sense of continuity of a thread that ties the present to the past. But of course the point is that this continuity isn't given; it has to be kind of forged. It has to be constructed conceptually and intellectually. So then orientation, this cosmic orientation implies seeing the discontinuity between, biological evolution, which is discontinuous and catastrophic, and cognitive evolution, which is precisely about forging continuity through discontinuity. And I wonder the sense that, so contingency, the term contingency, if cosmic history is, contingent, is that they accumulate, is necessarily kind of contingent, then surely, like, even once we've grasped this, any possible orientation requires, doing more than simply registering this contingency, and trying to kind of discern some kind of rational necessity, even in what seems absurd and kind of aleatory. So, I guess the point, and then the point is that, contingency in the biotic sphere tells us nothing about what is to be done at the level of sapience. Isn't this and the point is that this is why you can't succeed or fail at living in the biotic sphere. There's no success or failure.
Yeah.
This is why, like, nothing is, the point is that there's no normativity at the level of, adaptation. Nothing is better or worse adapted. It's just alive because living isn't for anything. And that's why survival isn't even the kind of, the great, Darwin's great philosophical message is that life doesn't have any point. Survival is not a goal. It's not for anything. It's not even survival. That's why survival of the fittest is a complete kind of misunderstanding of Darwin. Whereas, so what I'm saying here is that isn't there a kind of an asymmetry, between biotic contingency and the contingency that, sapience has to, sapience has to do something with this kind of biotic contingency, which is entirely underdetermined, or which is, in other words, nature science doesn't tell us, what to do or not to do. So yeah, this is just, I'm curious to, in a way, it implies that there's a disanalogy between history for sapiens, which is in a sense about accumulation, which is cumulative and teleological, and history in the kind of biotic sense, which because time doesn't imply teleological complexification. So if all that was alive, if the earth, if the cosmos is silenced because there's just bacteria, okay, maybe there's just lots of bacteria everywhere, So that means that there's lots of kind of stuff that's alive, but that doesn't, it means that kind of history in this kind of, organic sense doesn't have, is really disconnected from history in this cognitive sense. And I wonder what this implies about, if orientation is about making history cosmic so as to, produce cosmic history, the fact is that it might not, it may not go through. You can make history cosmic, but it won't tell you how to, how to produce or kind of generate cosmic history. I guess that's just the observation I was trying to make.
Again, there's a lot there. So I completely agree with this disanalogy, that there's no direction, there's no goal in biotic history. I think that sapiens is something, different. But I guess, an important part of that is memory, in the fact that, humans have cumulative culture because, there was oral traditions, allows techniques to, that would have had to have been rediscovered in each generation before speech and language. They can now just be transmitted across them, that accumulates, and then when you get the written record, that just explodes, and over time our memories just become bigger and bigger, and there's a sense in which there was a point in human history when the past didn't even seem alien because there wasn't enough historic record yet. It's unclear to me, for example, like ancient Egyptians talk about speaking for posterity or speaking to posterity, and they talk about monuments being, they talk about good acts, ones that become monuments. So they've clearly got this sense of history, but it's really unclear whether it occurred to them that people witnessing their monuments in the deep future might not regard them the same way that they did. It's because we've now, since then, have just accumulated far more historic records, so that it's almost undeniable that the past is like an alien country. So, as our memory grows, our idea of our historicity grows. And I guess, to take that back to the disanalogy point, it's more just, what are the material conditions for that sapient sense of progressive or cumulative, whatever you want to call it, history. And they do seem to hold at just, bigger and bigger scales as we've learned more. What that means, you can't look to nature to give us an answer. I absolutely agree with that. There's nothing that I'm not like trying to extract anything from, the physical prehistory.
No, that's clear.
No,
that's not. I wasn't. Didn't mean to suggest that at all. But I'm saying that I really like the point you're making. But I'm saying there seems something more has to be added. I think it's about for this orientation to proceed. It means that we have to. You have to. Isn't it like in a way the kind of the decentering? Like the more you emphasize the contingency and the kind of the arbitrariness of humanity and of how arbitrary and contingent the existence of human intelligence is, but at the same time, there has to be a kind of recentering of sapience, okay? Because if you say, because otherwise the conclusion is that, you know, it's, it's just as, you know, the conclusion is disorienting. It's just that, we're just, we're here and we'll soon be wiped out, and then maybe slugs or kind of something will take over, and that's it. It's just, there's no kind of, there's no trajectory, no direction. It's just one series of contingencies, and that's true. I mean, that's in a sense that's true at the level of facts, but also these the philosophers you're familiar with, they also emphasize that every fact, you know, in order to state a fact, you need a normative vocabulary. So every statement of facts, whether it's physical or biological, implies kind of, you know, a conceptual machinery which commits you to other claims, so that whether you like it or not, you're committed to making sense of the world. And the challenge is that, you know, you have to make sense of the world, because the world yields, you know, in a way it invites you to make sense of it, because it has no kind of intrinsic order or sense. So we have to have that vocabulary to assess factual claims. So you know, they're clear. To even get the business of inquiry up and running, we have to presuppose these certain norms, and then I guess the temptation then becomes to this idea that's always lurked in, you know, particularly the scientific tradition, to then try and, you know, then that means that our vocation is to like remake the external universe in the vision, in the image of reason. Yes.
Like, as with all ideas and how they play out and develop across history, they're always like just monstrously more complicated, and everything that surrounds them, all the, you know, upstream, downstream entailments, just way more complicated than anyone in the present anticipates. And so even though there might be a kernel of truth to this idea of like remaking the universe in the image of reason, maybe there is something good there in some sense. You know, I mean, I guess that's why, like, at the end, I just wanted to gesture to all these different possibilities. You know, you know, there is no. We're unfathomably far from having a final answer, such that, you know, I think that we must do something. You know, I mean, everyone, you know, we all assume that there could be this end of inquiry, this like, in some sense, a, you know, monolithic end goal or something. Because if we didn't, then why would we bother like updating our opinions when someone shows them to be inadequate?
Most people don't.
Indeed, yeah. We're you know, ultimately messy creatures. So, you know, we must act as if there's going to be this like Persean long run, but and it's a hope. It's like a regulative hope.
Exactly. I think that's what I mean. Is that you have to hope. I mean, to orient yourself, you have to hope. And so the Kantian question, what can I hope? You know, is like you. In order to do something, you also have to hope. You know, what can I do and what can I hope? You know, are kind of indissociable.
Absolutely, yeah. And also, just the more we know about the factual universe, and the more we discover about things, the more the range of our practical possibilities and potentials increases as well. And then, yeah, again, you know, maybe it's just me. I'm fond of the strawberry abstainer thing, because it just strikes me as so perverse that could happen. And then, you know, I also think, well, it would have been such a tragedy if humanity had gone extinct before, say, if it's 300 years ago, before discovering relativity, or, you know, or even just the aesthetic movements that have happened since. Like, so this end of inquiry, I don't think it's constitutive. I don't think we're promised it by creation or existence, or it's predestined in any sense. But like we have to act as if there is this summum bonum or something. But we now are preoccupied with certain visions of like striking out into the wider cosmos, and those are often very naive for lots of obvious reasons. But like it's again, to go back to that thing I was saying earlier, like if we leave it just to a certain type of person to make those proposals, then of course those proposals are going to be naive and anthropocentric in the wrong ways. And so I think just widening that conversation cannot be anything but good.
It's a great note to stop
Okay,
on.
yes, I think we should probably, thanks again, thanks Claire.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you for the amazing questions. Yeah, really.